Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar today. This is the latest in a series of webinars that we have organized looking at how biodiversity can be incorporated into our daily activities and business decision-making processes. But before we start, I would like to just mention a few things. Firstly, I would like to point out that the webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be made available via our YouTube channel shortly. Secondly, I would like to encourage you to post your questions in the chat, and I will address as many of them at the end of the presentation as I can. While I see some familiar faces today, or names today, there are some of you who are new to our webinars. So as a start, let me briefly introduce myself and endangered wildlife. Personally, my name is Shana Gavron, and I am the CEO of Endangered Wildlife. I have a joint finance and conservation background and about 15 years experience as a sell-side institutional equity analyst, but have been working on the solutions for biodiversity finance since 2005. One of the big challenges that I've seen over these many years is that there is a lack of common language between the finance world and the conservation world. It is this gap that endangered wildlife is trying to bridge by converting the complex concept of biodiversity into a common universal language, money. So in saying that, Endangered Wildlife is a consulting and software development company that is working with the financial valuation of both species and richness to help to facilitate this progress of integrating biodiversity into any form of decision. And this is what I plan to address today, looking at solutions available to businesses to integrate biodiversity into their activities. So let's start by looking at biodiversity in the context of businesses. We know for a fact that there are 1 million species at risk of extinction. We know for a fact that $44 trillion are at risk due to the impending biodiversity loss. We know for a fact that biodiversity provides humanity with vital material, non-material, and regulatory services. We know also for a fact that biodiversity underpins the ecosystem functions and is necessary for resilient stocks of natural capital. But sadly, we also know for a fact that there has been insufficient attention paid to biodiversity, and biodiversity has been grossly overutilized and marginalized. The results coming from IPBES and many other species-specific scientific studies are shocking in terms of the declining trends in biodiversity. Policymakers are finally reaching a point that they are acknowledging the risk that we are facing currently as a global community caused by this biodiversity loss. As a result, there is a growing drive to integrate ecosystems into decision-making, and this is key. Integration, not isolation. Businesses, economies, and society in general are a driving force behind the biodiversity loss. We're talking overexploitation, climate change, pollution, human needs. The goal to maximize the bottom line has been a short-sighted view that has caused irreversible damage and threatens the very businesses that have antagonized the current situation. One of the big challenges for businesses, though, is how to actually alter the mindset and perceive biodiversity as an asset rather than a mere right to use. There are challenges in interpreting and understanding metrics, in mitigating risks, and adapting businesses for the changing regulatory environment. Businesses need to find a balance between their human demand and natural capital supply It's the only way to ensure sustainable futures, all for businesses, society, and economies. Perhaps one of the issues is the lack of understanding. I have had numerous conversations, and stakeholders do not understand the measurements they are calculating. They don't understand how to interpret and how to use the results. And they are complex ideas to transmit to stakeholders, such as your investors and your consumers, and even your internal stakeholders. And with the bottom line always playing a dominant role, until the financial benefit of integrating biodiversity is understood and discussed through that organization, there will always be a level of reluctance. While integrating biodiversity into businesses may be seen as foregoing profits, actually integrating nature may in fact reduce costs. Transitioning towards nature-positive behavior, according to the WEF, could result in 395 million jobs and $10.1 trillion by 2030. And even while we know this, there's still only 20% of the CEOs who recognize biodiversity loss as a real risk. For many businesses, there are direct and indirect links with biodiversity. That's undeniable, either through the supply of goods or services, or through cost reductions, risk mitigation services that the biodiversity provides. Each of these costs or benefits should be recognized in the same way as any other asset or liability which is accounted for. So let's consider an example. According to IBIS World, the largest global industry by revenues for 2023 was the life and health insurance market, which had annual global revenues of $4.6 trillion. The first thought may be, why am I linking the importance of biodiversity to this industry? But the connection is obvious. According to the WHO, biodiversity supports human and societal needs, including food and nutritional security, energy, development of medicines and pharmaceuticals, fresh water. All of this underpins good health. Similarly, according to the CBD, biodiversity underpins nature's contributions to people and provides ecosystem goods and services that are essential to human health and well-being. And I could continue mentioning other sources linking human health to biodiversity. Now, what would happen if one of these keystone species supporting human health were to collapse? Would this lead to another global pandemic and put more strain on the insurance industry? Or would there be a need to increase healthcare insurance premiums? So what is the benefit of biodiversity to this industry? Well, biodiversity can act as a safeguard for the insurance industry. It can promote healthier lifestyles and create less strain on the insurance industry in terms of longer contributions to life insurance and fewer claims against medical insurance. And a prime example of this intricate relationship is actually the vulture. This is a valuation that we did for a partner NGO who works specifically with vultures. We did a species valuation of the South African Cape vulture, which is a heavily poached and poisoned species. Now, the population has a calculated value of around 26 million euros, of which just over 1% is the 30-year carbon sink value for the population. So if we were to put in place measures to protect the vultures, they would be helping to save value of 26 million euros. But there's one thing this value does not really encapsulate. According to studies, these vultures are at risk of becoming extinct. So what does this mean? Vultures act as one of the lines of defense between carcass pathogens and healthy individuals. Now, can you start seeing the importance of biodiversity to the insurance industry? Because when demonstrated in India, the loss of vultures led to a cost to the Indian public health system from 1993 to 2006 of around 30 billion euros. That's equivalent to over 2 billion euros per year. So being able to financially quantify these numbers means that the species becomes far simpler to understand and recognize within the standard business valuation process. So let's continue with the example. Let's remove the vultures from the scene, and then suddenly the lion is one of those species that becomes vulnerable to these dangerous pathogens. And in one region of South Africa alone, the lion population is worth nearly 590 million euros. Lose the vultures, and this is a significant loss of value, both to the country and to the local communities. So again, all of a sudden, by understanding the financial value of these lions, it becomes possible to relate to the importance of protecting the population and investing into the longer-term survival of the species. This may include, for example, development of new technologies, or to protect the species, or investing into the vultures so as to protect the implicit value of the lions. Now, not all businesses may be interested in a single species. Companies are collecting data under regulatory and policy requirements. They are assessing the risk and impact of their businesses in relation to biodiversity. And this is why we also look at the value of richness. This is a more all-encompassing value that looks at the integrity of the biodiversity within an ecosystem to determine the value created or destroyed through the management or effectively mismanagement of an area. This becomes a more practical tool for businesses to take those measurements and metrics that they are already collecting for reporting purposes and to actually use that information to make a like-for-like analysis of business plans while also acknowledging biodiversity as a real asset or risk. This allows biodiversity to be directly included into that whole project planning process or the investment decision-making process, and allows more traditional metrics such as ROIs to be applied directly to biodiversity. For example, you invest in technologies that can reduce automobile collisions with animals that are crossing the road. The value of the biodiversity impact may actually warrant this investment, as this becomes a measurable return that can be communicated to investors and consumers as to why such a technology should exist. In Europe and North America, a common roadkill is the deer. And deer are actually one of the animals most likely to cause damage to a vehicle. So once again, an obvious link to the insurance industry. Additionally, to the automobile industry. An anti-roadkill technology could save plenty for both the insurance companies, for private individuals, and specifically in this case, in Scandinavia, it would have an impact of nearly 1.5 million euros on average for every red deer that is saved, because this is the value of the red deer. Looking at the just value of biodiversity now, I felt it was appropriate to start actually with this particular photo of Gilbert the seahorse. We've been working with an NGO from Cambodia that rehabilitates seagrass beds and seahorse habitats, and we actually ran a competition to name the seahorse in this picture. The winning name was Gilbert. Well, perhaps it should have been Gilberta, but why am I telling you about Gilbert? Well, seahorses are one of the most effective predators and are actually really quite unique animals. But besides poaching and fishing, they are tragic victims of habitat degradation. Without having strong anchors, seahorses are easily swept away with the tide, as they are not great swimmers. And the result is that in many areas, they are now actually functionally extinct. Many people currently view seagrass as the new solution for carbon sequestration. But seagrass is vital to protecting coastal properties from extreme tides, and of course, providing food and shelter to a myriad of species, including little Gilbert here. Following the events of COP15, there have been increased focus on two aspects of biodiversity for business. The first is reporting. The GRI recently published recommendations for its biodiversity reporting standards. These include a significant amount of data that needs to be collected and published, such as lists of species, counts, hotspots, risks. Now, this is a valuable step forward in terms of being able to identify the levels of impact and exposure for businesses, but it holds the existing limitation of interpretation and understanding. The second concept that is growing in terms of solutions for businesses are biodiversity credits and offsets. Now, for clarity purposes, let's just define these two concepts. By definition, biodiversity credits are a mechanism that allows stakeholders to invest in environmental projects that contribute to richer biodiversity. It is a legal document that describes where the environmental action has taken place, who has developed it, according to what methodology, and that it has been certified according to a certain system. Now, these credits may be transacted after issuance. So this is something based on positive action and is not required by law. In contrast, a biodiversity offset is defined as a mechanism used to compensate for biodiversity loss, with a goal to create a no net loss and even a positive net gain of biodiversity. It is often connected to land exploitation for building, mining, and other activities that have or deemed to have a negative environmental impact. Now, biodiversity offsets are often legal requirements in countries. But both concepts serve a purpose and can be effectively used by businesses to signify their support for biodiversity. But there are two particular points I would like to raise on these. The first is that, unlike carbon, biodiversity differs location to location. So, for example, a grey wolf in Scandinavia has a value of nearly 2 million euros, compared to the same wolf species in Yellowstone National Park, which has a value of nearly 4.8 million euros. And even on a more local regional basis, we have demonstrated that the value of a bald eagle in California is 2.4 million euros on average, compared to 1.2 million in Iowa. Therefore, from the perspective of offsets, it's not possible to directly offset a negative action in one region with a credit from another region. This is because biodiversity in different regions is not homogeneous and therefore not truly fungible. Secondly, how are credits priced? Now, let's take, for example, the Malaysian Biodiversity Conservation Certificate that was issued several years back. Essentially, they stated that every 100 square meters of restored or protected forest ecosystem was sold to oil palm companies at a price of $10. Now, is this the just value of the ecosystem? Likely not. So let's just first consider what is a just value. Now, by legal definition, it's quite simple. A just value is a fair market value. So we could say that the just value of a cow living on 100 square meters of land would probably be worth more than $10. So why would an entire forest ecosystem be worth only $10? Going back to Gilbert and to the seagrass in which Gilbert lives, for every hectare, there would be significant value being generated. So why would that hectare sell for a negligible value of less than or equal to a carbon credit? Remembering that carbon is an element and not a living organism. Therefore, while biodiversity credits have the potential to allow businesses to engage with conservation and consider biodiversity within their activities, it is crucial that the credits are based on real, just values. The actual value of the species or ecosystem that it contributes to society, to economy, and the environment must be accounted for. This is something that is done for all other assets. So why not make biodiversity an exception? By financially valuing biodiversity, mechanisms such as biodiversity credits can be integrated at a more suitable level. An investment into biodiversity should be no different to that of a company investment. Biodiversity generates returns and creates significant value that should not be understated by using simplified pricing methods. This is also a way to ensure that habitat restoration promotes ecosystem integrity. Planting trees for carbon is not always the solution and can, in fact, become detrimental to the native ecosystem. Only trees that are native to an area should be planted to ensure a healthy, thriving ecosystem. This is how to maximize biodiversity impact and value, which far exceeds that of just carbon. So last year, during our September webinar, we carried out an annual revaluation of the Yellowstone National Park wolf. In April 2021, the value of the wolf was 3.4 million euros. In a year, the value had increased to the 4.8 million that we had previously mentioned. Now, this represented an increase in value of 38%. Comparatively, the EU ETS carbon price at that time had increased by 20% year on year. The US 10-year government bond offered a yield of 3%, and the global equity index value had actually declined by 16%. This shows effectively how biodiversity, when priced properly, can actually outperform the rest of the market. This means that once the true value of biodiversity is understood, there's greater incentive to support the foundations of life on this planet and make a greater impact that is more meaningful than merely checking all the boxes. This is a solution to actually quantify your SDGs, such as life on land and life underwater. And currently we are the leader and the only company able to demonstrate the justifiable financial value of biodiversity, both species and richness, that corresponds with the EU-aligned standards that are proposed. It is not the solution to rely on 30 by 30. This is a temporary measure that does not protect migratory species or those species that are not living in what are deemed as hotspots. Do we really have the right to state that these lives are worth any less? Instead, biodiversity should be integrated into business strategies, and that can help benefit the bottom line. It's therefore the responsibility of the private sector to actually lead the way forward and benefit from and support biodiversity.